Hello, so today I want to do a tier list of the current items in set 14. This is mostly in preparation of the items getting a major change coming up next Wednesday. A couple of the items are going to completely change, which can shake up the whole thing. So I wanted to do a little bit of a video here, just talk about how they currently perform and how much I would like to make them in my games, or how often I'm making certain items in my game. If you like my content, make sure to like and subscribe. I normally do guides. This is a more for fun video. It's just a tier list where I'm just going to discuss some key concepts about items. But if you want to get more informative guides on how to play different augments or different play styles or different boards, this is your place to be, so make sure to check out my channel. Of course, next week, I've already alluded to this a lot, I'm going to be making my updated item guide. So this is an item guide I did for set 13. I'm going to do a multi-part series where I talk about all the aspects of items with a set 14 twist, and I will also go over the new item changes. So you can think of this video that you're watching as a precursor to the discussion that I will present in those videos another time. So let's talk about the items. If you see the tiers, they're a little bit different. It's mostly when I talk about them, how good the item is in order to make it at an earlier stage. Like when I say slamming, it means I'm always making it. It's a good use of components. Probably making or good means that I don't think I'll get punished for using my components in that way. And then situationally good needs to justify and rarely, just cascading down. A lot of times when I'm talking about items, I'll talk a lot about item economy, which I'll introduce right now by looking at Deathblade, right? Deathblade is a really strong item. It is one of the strongest items in the game. However, I am very rarely just slamming a Deathblade instantly. Now, probably making or good or situationally good, it finds itself somewhere in here. And it basically just comes down to how good you think the item is on the respective unit that you're playing. And I'll explain why. Deathblade, if you read the units or read the item, let me go here, items, so I can just show you. This gives you a little bit more stats. I'll just tab out to this site, right? Deathblade, it gives you a bunch of attack damage. It gives you the damage amp. But the problem with Deathblade is from an item economy standpoint, it uses a lot of swords. Consider a comp where you are playing multiple AD carries, or a lot of times when you're playing an AD carry, you usually have other units that also can use the same components. Think you're playing Xayah and Aphelios, for example. If you get dropped sword, and you instantly make a Deathblade, okay, that's great. What if you don't get dropped another sword? What items are you making for the Xayah? A Giant Slayer? Nope, can't make that. You already used your sword. Are you making an Infinity Edge? Nope, you can't make that. You already used your swords. That's the problem with Deathblade a lot of times. It works really well in certain comps if you have a solo carry, or it works really well if you high roll and you have a bunch of swords. But there's a standpoint called item economy. The idea is that if you use certain components, you're less likely to get dropped the same component again in TFT. So a lot of the times, unless you have a huge influx of these components, it can be very difficult for you to manage those in meaningful ways. For example, it's better to make multiple items for multiple carries than it is to use all your components for one unit and then just have a bunch of leftover stuff that's going to be hard to work with later. That's why sometimes you'll see people say, oh, I'd rather make an IE here, even though Deathblade might be better for certain units in stats, or you might look at it and it might look stronger and be stronger. It's just a matter of finding a way to use your components in a meaningful way. So that's like the first thing that I want to talk about. That's why Deathblade, it's a really strong item, and it works really well on certain units. There's lots of units that love to have Deathblade. However, it's situational if I'm making it. So I'm going to put it on just good, because even though it's a situational item, it is a really good item. But that's the idea that this tier list is going to be revolving around. The concepts of the item. I'm not just ranking on, this is the most broken item in the game, slam it, an easy win. It's like, no, it's like you have to manage your resources in a way that provides the best examples for you to itemize everybody in a good way. Another example, this item's getting changed, so my opinion might change on it later, but currently, Guardbreaker is an item that I'm always okay with slamming, right? If you think about your items, glove components are kind of hard to make items with a lot of the times. Infinity Edge is good in Jewel Gauntlet, sure. These can be like a singular item on your unit, but Thieves Gloves situationally could kind of grief, but you know, you need multiple gloves to do that, and then you might run out of gloves. So a lot of times Thieves Gloves you know, it's more of a tempo slam and a late game thing, but it's not really good in the mid game. Last Whisper is only good with certain comms. Hand of Justice is only good with certain units. Steadfast Heart, not one of the best tank items, but a lot of times you're just forced to make it. QSS or Quicksilver, good on some units, not good on others. It's not something that's really like an easy slam all the time, right? So Glove, you kind of run into this problem, and a similar thing with Belt, right? You can make a similar argument with Belt. These are components that often, if you have too many of them, it becomes a little bit awkward. Belt's a little bit better because you can always make like Warmogs and other stuff with it. But a lot of times, something that works really well is Guardbreaker. This is one of the best slams you can make because you don't really get punished too hard, right? The Belt might be a little bit awkward, but you have options, right? Belt is a utility item typically, so you might lock yourself out of some utility. But Guardbreaker, that's why I always put it in this high tier. The item to me is not like Giga Broke. It's not like if you slam Guardbreaker, you win the game instantly, but it gives a lot of stats, right? It gives attack speed, ability power, it also gives crit chance and damage am, so it gives a wide variety of stats that's really good. The crit chance makes a really good item pairing for units that have ults that crit, or if you make your ult crit, like you pair it up with an Infinity Edge, for example. And then additionally, it also provides damage am, so it gives you multiple ways of scaling up your damage for a carry while using components that I'm not too like stressed to hold on to later. Now, later in the changes that are coming next week, Guardbreaker is going to be really tied to having an ult that crits or having a higher crit chance. So my opinion of it might change a little bit because it's going to be more particular when you can use it. But as of right now, you can very, very rarely get punished for slamming a Guardbreaker. So a lot of times it makes sense, and I'm usually a Guardbreaker enjoyer, and I make it pretty often. But now, I just want to show those two examples just to talk about them. Now we're going to go through all of the items in order as you see it here. So Warmogs. I think Warmogs is probably making it really good. If I have a lot of belts, belt isn't an item where I'm looking to make a lot of things with it. A lot of times it makes worse versions of items that I would want to make otherwise. The only thing that's really good is like utility items with it. So like anti-heal is usually belt dependent, and some of the frontline items like an even shroud is pretty dependent on it. But Warmog just gives you so much HP. It just works really well. It scales up your HP and it gives you a bunch of base HP. So I'm usually making a Warmogs if I have a lot of belts. It's not something that I feel like I'm going to get punished, in the future for. Next we have Adaptive Helm. So Adaptive Helm is an item where I'm going to talk about item economy again a little bit. So when you think about your components, what does Adaptive Helm make? Adaptive Helm, or what is Adaptive Helm made of, right? Adaptive Helm is made of two components, right? It's made of a tier and a cloak. Okay, that's cool. A tier and a cloak. The problem with the tier and a cloak, so usually when you're making Adaptive Helm, sometimes it's really good, right? Obviously, like if you have a frontline unit that likes to cast a lot, you can put on that frontline unit and then they'll be really, really strong, right? It gives good stats as a frontline item. It's also very flexible because you can use it as a frontline or a backline item. So as a frontline item, it generates mana. It's one of the only ways to generate mana additionally as a frontline item, besides this is like actually good. So like works really well as a frontline item, and it's flickering, my bad. And it gives you armor and magic resist. The back two rows, it kind of works as a mana generation item, but it's a little bit of an awkward mana generation item because it's tied to time instead of auto attacks. Meanwhile, like blue buff is tied to casting and Shojin is tied more to auto attacks. So it's not a popular backline item, but it does work as a backline item as well. Here's the main issue with Adaptive Helm, right? If you're playing an AD style comp, right? So let's say you're playing Vanguard Marksman. You're not playing around an AP carry. Adaptive Helm is pretty good to make because it's a reliable frontline item that makes use of some components that you would otherwise want to use in other places. If you're playing AP, however, item economy makes a little bit awkward of an item slam. Now, why is that? No matter what your AP carry is, a lot of times no matter who they are, they usually want to have a way of casting, which is going to be either a Shojin or a blue buff, which both require tiers. So Adaptive Helm you can use as a way of casting, but it's just like a lot of times it's less effective on those units. There's some units that work really well with it. I think it's really good on Dynamo units because the 3-second mana gen works the same cycle as the Dynamo mana gen, so it can work. So there's some synergy there. But in general, you're usually trying to make a Shojin or a blue buff. So making Adaptive Helm, a lot of times when you look at Adaptive Helm, it's like an extra item that you're putting on a unit that already has a mana generation. The bigger issue that I have with it is that even if you use it as a mana generation, it uses two components that are quite important for AP carries. So if you think about a tier you can make a Shiv with. Shiv is your way of getting Shred. What's the other way to get Shred? It's with a Spark. So these are the ways that you can maximize your damage by reducing magic resist to do more damage. However, if you're making Adaptive Helm, you're using a Cloak and a Tier, and you need a Cloak for a Spark or a Tier for Shiv. It makes it a lot harder to hit those components and to find Shred via other means. So when you're playing in an AP style comp, it actually feels a little bit worse. Additionally, a lot of the frontline units that love mana generation don't really like Adaptive Helm as much as Protector's Vow. Protector's Vow just works a lot better to get the initial cast off, while Adaptive Helm works to get repeated casts off. But the initial cast with a lot of the stun units often matters more, so a lot of times you don't even want to make it as a frontline item, you'd rather save it to make a Protector's Vow, so it's a little bit awkward in some cases, mostly with AP. That's why I put it on situationally good. If you need a frontline unit to cast, it can work really well. However, I'm not usually making it because there's a way that I can get screwed over really effectively by like not having the correct item slams. Now, we're going to start to speed up with these because I've introduced the main concepts so we can apply that to the rest of the items. So the rest of these are going to go a little bit faster. Jewel Gauntlet, generally good use of components. I'm usually making a Jewel Gauntlet if I have Jewel Gauntlet components and I'm playing around an AP carry. Bloodthirster is one of the better melee style items, so a lot of times I'm making it if I'm playing around melee carries, so I'll put it up there. Blue buff I think is situationally good. The only time you really want to make a blue buff is if it's a blue buff holder, and those are usually more spare, so it's very rare that you want to make a blue buff. Even if you have multiple tiers, tiers are really good at making both frontline and backline items. A lot of the good frontline items also work with tiers, so I would very rarely make a blue buff unless I know for sure I'm playing like a Vex or a Vigar or one of the units that actually can make use of blue buff. It's not very flexible as an item. Bramble Vest, I'm probably making it because there's not that much use of the components. Chainmail is one of those items similar to Glove and Belt where it's a little bit awkward to make items with. I would say it's situationally good because it's like, you know, it's really good early game, right? If you have a Bramble Vest early game, a lot of the units don't have huge damage, so they're just doing a lot of auto attacks, and auto attacks make up a large portion of their damage. However, that's not really relevant past like stage 2. Stage 2, Bramble Vest already starts to kind of fall off. The problem is there's not much better use of the components, so it's like a little bit awkward. I usually flicker between saying it's situationally good. Obviously, it just provides a shit ton of armor. If your lobby doesn't have a lot of damage that's like AD damage, like if everybody's playing AP in your lobby and you make a Bramble Vest, or if majority are playing AP and you make a Bramble Vest, it feels bad. So you can argue that it's here. I'm gonna put it here just because I live for like the like if I still look at like if I have a bunch of chainmails, I have to make it, but I'm not gonna be seeking out to make it, if that makes sense, right? It's just like I'd rather try and make other items because like even if your lobby is entirely AP or AD, like if your lobby's all AD, you put it here. If your lobby's AP, the Bramble Vest does close to nothing. I'd rather just hold on to the chainmails and make gargoyles in a lot of cases, if that makes sense. It's like only good early game, or if you're like your lobby's all AD. Excuse me, I'm like slurring my words. Blah, blah. Okay, Crown Guard. I think it's good on some units, so I'm going to put it on situationally good. But often it kind of falls in the needs to justify right now, but I think I'll put it here. Declaw, similar idea as Bramble Vest. I would look at my lobby and see if my lobby has primarily AP or AD, and then decide based on that. Even Shroud, again, I think Even Shroud is in situationally good. This is a utility item, so it is good. However, Even Shroud isn't that strong of an item. It doesn't give that many stats a lot of the time, so it's a little bit awkward. You'd rather just put your, you'd rather take like your Last Whisper, and I'm going to put Last Whisper up, right? Like if you're finding a way of making Sundering, a lot of times you'd rather make a Last Whisper or the quote-unquote Sunder Gun, as I like to call it in the past. It just works a little bit better. It's a little bit more efficient, and it stays alive longer. A lot of times with Even Shroud, it's not quite a tank item, and then you put on your front line, then your front line dies, and then your Even Shroud's dead, and then everything's sad and everything's miserable. Protector's Vow, a lot of units really like Protector's Vow. I think it's like a better item in general to make. Once again, you're using a tier, so if you're playing an AP line, you might have trouble making that extra mana generation item for them. However, in a lot of comms, I'm pretty happy with Protector's Vow. I think it actually works really well in the current meta, and there's a lot of units that love to get their cast off early. Think Leona, think Sejuani. Those are like the prime examples, and there's lots of other ones, and also gives like a second lease at life with a health shield, which is actually pretty effective. Guardbreaker. So Guardbreaker, last set, this is actually a huge change from last set to this set. Last set, this item was absolute dog shit. But this set, there's so much hyperinflation with how much HP everything has that Guardbreaker usually, Giant Slayer usually has a lot of value. I'm putting in situationally good. Now, the thing is, it uses a sword and a bow, so it's not as good, in my opinion, as something like a Guardbreaker. And usually, your Giant Slayer is going to be a secondary item, so like it's not going to be your main carry item. It's going to be your main carry item, but it's not going to be your first item. It's not going to be your second item. It's going to be like your third prioritization of just like topping off your damage in the best way possible. I don't think it's a great use of components because a lot of times the swords and the bows are really hotly contested items in almost every comp. If you're playing AP, it makes a little bit more sense because you want to kill a sword somehow, but it's like a little bit awkward. It is really good on a lot of units, but I don't think it's in the tier of these items which I think are a lot better use of components or are really strong, right? It's just like kind of a little bit worse than that. So I'm gonna put it here. Edge of Night, I think, is situationally good, obviously, if you're playing around that unit. Guinsoo. In the current landscape of the game, Guinsoo is really popular. There's actually a lot of Guinsoo carries. And Guinsoo is like a really important item on a lot of those carries because it helps them to ramp up and scale up pretty effectively. But I'm going to put on situationally good because there are units that, like, you have to be an auto attacker to use Guinsoo well. A lot of units aren't auto attackers, so they can't make great use of the Guinsoo. Hodge, same thing, situationally good if you're playing a melee style carry. It can also work on backline units if you're trying to stack up crit chance because it does give crit chance. So it's somewhere over there. Gunblade, I think Gunblade, this one's hard. I feel like Gunblade needs to justify. I think the units are very particular that want Gunblade. You're very rarely looking to make Gunblade unless you have a unit that drops nukes like Vex, or a unit that just does an insane amount of damage into late game like Aphelios, right? So like it's good on some units, but you usually don't want to make Gunblade first, right? If you're playing Vex, it's essential. You have to make Gunblade. But that's very, very situational. That means if you're making Gunblade, you're usually playing towards Vex. You could put it on like Xayah or Aphelios, and you could put on some other units as well. I'm not going to name every single unit that can use a Gunblade. But the problem is a lot of those other units, you want the components in other ways, right? Like if I was playing Aphelios, I care more about having a Guinsoo than I care about having a Gunblade. If I'm playing Xayah, I care way more about having like a Deathblade or a like IE or something like that, or a Giant Slayer, than having a Gunblade. So I put in the needs to justify tier because I'd have to justify, okay, why am I making Gunblade when I would rather make these other items for these other comps, if that makes sense. IE, it's a great use of glove, and a lot of times if you're making it, it's like almost every AD build, usually you can put an IE on them and it's good. It's really flexible, and it just scales up your damage in a pretty meaningful way. It works pretty well on most units that are doing AD damage, and it's a good use of components, and a lot of builds revolve around you having like IE plus another glove item to do a bunch of damage. Spark, I'm going to put in situationally good. It's similar to Even Shroud. It's just a frontline item that doesn't give that much frontline stats, so a lot of times you'd rather make the equivalent, which in this case is going to be Static Shiv. If you can put in your backline and you can have it last longer, that's a better use of your shred / sunder stuff, if that makes sense. Gargoyle, situationally good, of course, right? A lot of the tank items, it comes down to whatever components you have left over, but additionally it comes down to like looking at your opponents and understanding like which items work best. So it's a pretty efficient use of components. It works better on solo frontline units. However, it's not like that bad, if that makes sense. because like it's still a way to get armor or magic resist out of the other component, if that makes sense. So like a lot of times, like let's say you get really unlucky and you have a bunch of chainmails, this is a way to turn those chainmails into magic resist. That's like a good idea of it. But then also it works really effectively on rerolls and solo frontline units, so it has some other use cases that bumps it to situationally good. Archangel, same thing. You need like a really good frontline in order for Archangels to scale up effectively. That's like the main thing. Morello, I think Morello is really good. A lot of times, so Morello is really good if you're trying to itemize multiple backline carries. So Morello isn't that great as a singular damage item. How do I phrase it? It's not good as a damage item. It's a utility item that provides with anti-heal. So it's really good because you need anti-heal, and the other alternatives are kind of awkward. However, I'm not usually making it anymore. Before I used to always make it. They actually changed items now. That items aren't, there's not as many item drops, if that makes sense. So because there aren't that many item drops, a lot of times it's really hard to itemize multiple carries and itemize a tank. So I actually put in situationally good, because before it was like an always make. I would like usually just like, oh, I have Morello, okay, I can make that and I'll put it on Ziggs, or I'll put on my secondary AP carry, or I'll put on somebody in the backline that has good spread. It's all good, right? At late game, I'll move it on to an Aurora, right? Everything's wonderful and amazing. But the problem with it is that now you often don't have enough items to itemize your backline and your frontline and a third unit, unless you have like hack drops and stuff like that. So it's a lot less consistent. That's why I move it down a tier. Next is Nashers. Nashers I'm putting in rarely. I don't think Nashers used to be like a really flexible item that you would make with Shojin. Just you get a cast off, you get a bunch of attack speed, and you just chain cast. There's like nobody that's relevant that wants to chain cast as opposed to just do upfront damage. Like it's really good on like chain cast units that want to cast a bunch, but like Vex, for example, you need to have Gunblade, so you don't have room for Nashers. Brand, you want to nuke, you don't have room for Nashers. Ziggs, you don't have room for Nashers. Aurora, you'd rather nuke, you don't have room for Nashers. Elise, you don't have room for Nashers. Like the only unit that really wants to put Nashers is Annie, and it's even debatable if you want to put Nashers on her, right? Because Annie's like the only unit that like you actually scale off having chain cast, because you could summon like 2 Tibbers at once in some cases and have 2 Tibbers out there just like railing your opponent. Other than that, I'm rarely making it. There's just no point. It does like almost nothing. The only time I'm making it is just from an item economy standpoint. Like if I'm left over with a bow and a belt, then I will make a Nashers. Do you know what I mean? So that's what I mean by rarely. Like I'm not starting the game with bow belt and saying, oh, it's a Nashers game, we're in this, if that makes sense. I know that there's some units that also can use it, but I think those are mostly like memes. Like I know like everybody like swears by like Graves and Nashers, it's broken. It's like, yes, I understand, but that's not the point of this video. It's like you know, like I'm not making a Nashers very often, right? Like maybe if I get it dropped with the golden oxy that gives it to you for free, it's like, yeah, I have a Nashers. That's like when I'm playing that, you know what I mean? QSS, situational. It is a good use of components, and a lot of times you can even use a QSS as a backline item in place of like a Gwynsu, because it just gives a lot of attack speed. However, the cloak is like maybe better used other places, and so is the glove. So it's just like it's basically just a bunch of attack speed and immune to stun. It doesn't give you that many other stats. It doesn't really scale up your damage really well unless you're a melee carry and you can really like pop off with it. But like it's okay. Right? That's the thing. It's situational, but I don't think it's like broken. I'm not starting the game off and slamming it instantly. Rabadons follows the same thing as Deathblade. Rabadons and Deathblades are 2 of the highest cap items in the game. They are so incredibly strong. However, even though they're really strong, they're really broken, I'm often not making it that often, right? So like, you know, they kind of balance out, right? Their power level is here, but their making is here. So, you know, I'm putting them here, right? Like there's 4 tiers. They're somewhere in between, right? So they're either here or here. And you guys can decide if you guys like this better, if this makes you feel more comfy at home, do that, sure. But they're just somewhere in between the 2 of them, right? That's like the thing. That's the point that I'm trying to make. The main thing is that you shouldn't get baited too much by how strong they are, because even though they're really strong, item economy dictates that if you use both your rods or both your swords, a lot of times if you're playing Rabadons, what's your next item going to be? You know, if you have Rabadon's JG, you high roll because you have 3 rods and you're playing AP. That's like the best case scenario. But like, what do you do if you don't have other items, right? You're using all your rods. You're unable to make those other AP items. You can't make a jewel gauntlet for another carry. You can't make, like, you know, other things like Spark, for example, right? Like, you're using all your components that are used to scale up your AP units. It makes it hard for you to make use of your leftover components. It's like more situational. Red buff, I think it's the same tier as Morello. It's really good, but it doesn't give that much damage. And it also uses 2 bows, which is a little bit hard to justify sometimes. Redemption, this is one of the things that's getting changed, so we'll see how it fares in the newer patches. But Redemption right now, I think it's situational. If you have like an insane front line, it works really well because it has like an AoE healing effect, so it can actually heal multiple of your units. So it's really nice. But you need to have a lot of HP to make good use of it, because other than its bonus effect, you don't get that much value out of it if you don't have a like you'd rather use the tier in the belt in other ways, is what I mean to say. Runans. So Runans, I'm gonna put in it's here or here. It's here or here. I'm gonna put in needs to justify. So Runans is actually an item that's getting completely reworked, and next patch it's going to be very interesting to see where it falls. Runans suffers from 2 big problems, right? The first one is its actual effect, right? So Runans, if you read it, it gives you some attack damage, gives you some attack speed, and basically when you attack, you fire an extra bolt that does 50% of your attack damage. So it basically lets you have like a little bit of an AoE effect. In history, Runans is very particular on who it's good with. A lot of times, it's really good with units that auto-attack a bunch because you're just spreading out damage. It's really good with the augment that just makes your Runans do more damage, of course, right? But usually, it's really good on empowered auto-attacking units. So who's an example of that? Think like Jinx, for example, right? Like, I'm not sure if it's really good on Jinx because I'll get into the second problem, but it would be like if Jinx, like somebody like Jinx, it would typically work well with, because when she casts her ult, she fires these extra rockets which turn into like auto attacks or extra attacks, I think, and then they still proc the Runans. I'm pretty sure that with Jinx, at least in the first patch, I haven't tried it on Jinx since the first patch, but her ult casted the extra Runans. That's typically where the Runans is good, right? When units have an ult that makes their X auto attacks more powered, and then the Runans effect procs with that extra effect, if that makes sense. The problem is that it's hard to replace an item with a Runans for a lot of units. So if you think about a lot of units, you'd rather just scale up their damage a lot of the time instead of just getting the Runans, which doesn't do that much for them. It can work really well with like Guinsoo holders, but it's just like often less powerful than another item that either gives more attack speed or gives more damage. In a lot of cases, you'd rather have double Guinsoo than Guinsoo Runans, because you're just better off scaling up your auto attacks with the Guinsoos than to have the Runans, if that makes sense, right? The other problem that you run with Runans is that it uses a bow and a cloak. So if you're using a bow and a cloak, what items need bow and cloak? Your sundering items. Even Shroud uses a cloak, and Last Whisper uses a bow. So now you run into the problem of it's very particular on who it's good with. It's a very particular item. It's okay on certain units if you have the augment, of course, but it's very particular of an item. And then additionally, it kills your ability to easily make sundering, which is really critical and important for your units to just do more damage. So you really have to justify it. I'm actually going to put in rarely tier for that reason alone, right? It's somewhere between here and here. You can put it here if you want, whatever, right? The problem is that you need to not only do you have to justify it, you also have to justify like making it that it's good on the unit, but then you also have to justify like that you're getting rid of your ability to make sundering a lot of the time. So right now in the current landscape of the game, there's not enough units, in my opinion, that make use of the Runans. In previous sets, there was a little bit more nuance to it, because there were a lot of units that actually liked it quite a bit and could make really good use out of it. But as of right now, there's not really that many. So I put in the rarely make. It's similar to like Nashers. If I have one, or if I'm playing the augment maybe with like Vayne reroll, but even Vayne reroll has fallen off a little bit. That is not as popular anymore. So it's hard to say. Shojin, I'm going to put in the probably making. So Shojin isn't a good item, right? If you read Shojin, it does not give you that many effects or that many stats, right? It just gives you a little bit of AD, a little bit of ability power, and starting mana. And then the only thing that it does is it makes your auto attacks grant 5 bonus mana. This is really important because the 5 extra mana that you get for the auto attacks is actually what makes it a really good item. It's a very flexible way to get casters to cast, and it's pretty much essential on almost every casting unit that doesn't need a blue buff. Usually it's either blue buff or it's Shojin. Sometimes you can make use of Adaptive Helm. There's some units that really like Adaptive Helm, but that one's even more particular than blue buff in my opinion in some cases. But either way, if you're playing Brand, this Brand is not going to cast unless you have the Shojin to help him generate the cast. And so much of his ability, because he's an AP unit, he's an AP backliner, he's not doing damage with auto attacks. So you're basically just waiting for him to cast to do all of his damage. So you need him to cast. So that's why you need to make Shojin. Done. It's also good on some AP AD units, but typically the AD units you just scale up with more damage. Just put 3 damage items if they're not a Gwynsu holder. That's what makes Shojin a really good slam. It's also a really good use of components because when you're playing AP, what else do you make with a sword? I don't know. Like maybe a Giant Slayer? Like a Gunblade, but that's like particular. So it actually is a way to get rid of a component that you otherwise don't really want with your comp. So it actually not only makes it really nice, it like you really don't get punished. That's what I mean to say, right? It makes it really nice to make it because if you use your sword, you're not worried that you need to get another sword. You actually don't want to see any more swords. It's a really good use of the component. And additionally, it's essential for a lot of those comps. And then on top of that, it's also very flexible because you can put a Shojin on so many different units. Basically, any casting unit, you could put the Shojin on. So you actually have a wide variety of units to put it on. So you don't even get punished for it being very particular, similar to like blue buff or adaptive helm, where it has to be on certain units or else it feels very bad. That's why I'm going to put in the probably making / good. If I start the game off and I have an AP opener and I have Shojin components, I'm probably making Shojin and committing towards AP. That's like how a lot of these items work, except for Rabadons and Deathcap, where these ones are more so like, you know, just here because of their general power level. I'm actually going to put them towards the end of this just so it doesn't get too confusing. Next, Steadfast, situationally good, but not so much. It's a good use of components, like I said before, but it's just like very rarely like a giga broken frontline item. Sterix as well, right now is pretty situational. It kind of works as like a late game kind of like giga tank item thing. Without Unleash the Beast, it's actually a pretty unreliable item, but it does work really well on some units that like to have the HP. Like it's kind of like a little bit like a tank melee AD item. It's getting reworked to be more of like an Omnivamp item similar to Bloodthirster with a health shield. But right now, it's kind of like in here or here, right? Actually, I'm going to put it here. It needs to justify because actually most of the melee users don't want it, right? It's really good on Garen, right? Is it good on Zed? I don't think it's good on Zed. I don't think there's many other melee units that you can reliably play around that like it, right? Like I don't think it's good on Rengar. Like Rengar typically you don't want it. You want like either you want like triple Omnivamp, like you want double Omnivamp damage or double Omnivamp Titans or something. I'm gonna put it needs to justify. I think it's rare that you make it's good on Mundo, right? That's it. It's just really good on Mundo. If you're playing Mundo reroll, it's like a good slam sometimes, or it's good early game, and it's a good use of sword. That's what I mean. It's like I feel like there's not enough units that use it. I find it similar to Gunblade, so I'm gonna put it there. Sunfire, I'm gonna put it situationally good. I think in the past I used to rank Sunfire in A tier, but I think the problem is that it's actually like I think I was a little bit hyperinflated on how good I thought it was. I think a lot of the times now, if you're playing around backline units that can actually make use of the you know what? Maybe I'll just still put in probably making. I think I'll still put it here. It's debatable. My opinion on it definitely decreased from the last time I made a tier list like this. But the main thing is that it provides you with anti-heal. It's a good use of components because chainmail and belt aren't things that you really care too much about. And additionally, it's really good early game, right? Having anti-heal early game could often sway your fights because, like, just like reducing the healing and adding that percentage damage tick on everybody is pretty effective. Now, it's better usually to make your anti-heal or put it on a backline unit or make a backline item like a Morello or a red buff, just because it's easier to apply it to multiple targets and it helps to itemize a secondary carry. So that's why I was going to put it in situationally good tier, but because of the recent changes that makes it really hard to itemize 2 carries, it's actually going back into this upper tier, because on your backline unit you typically want 3 damage items. So on your main carry, if you want 3 damage items, then it makes sense to put the anti-heal on your front line, because you don't have the ability to itemize a secondary carry in a lot of the games nowadays, at least if you don't have hacks. If you have hacks, then you can move it down, but if you're playing a game and there's not that many item hacks, then Sunfire usually is a good slam. Thieves Gloves. I think Thieves Gloves is somewhere between situationally good and probably making good. I'm going to put in situationally good. I think Thieves Gloves can sometimes work really well, but it's just using a lot of glove components, which might make it hard to make items later, because glove components can help scale you pretty effectively with like crit chance items. I think that it's really good as a tempo slam early game, but it's really bad mid game, and then it's good late game because you can very efficiently itemize your 5 cost carries. And then Titans is somewhere in situationally good as well. I think this is what I would do for now. Let me see if I want to change anything. I'm just playing around with this. I'm not ordering the tiers, but I think this is pretty good. But basically, like, the main way that I'm ranking them, like I said, I gave my explanations. Hopefully that was informative and fun. Yeah, and if you disagree, I won't be reading the comments anyways, so have fun. See ya, enjoy, and yeah, if you're looking for the item guide, that's what I was gonna say. If you're looking for the item guide coming out next week, just stay tuned. I'm gonna talk about the concepts I was using to talk about each of these items in a lot more detail, but I just want to make this one because I thought it'd be fun introductory way of starting the discussion on items, so that my channel is kind of set up that way for next week if you're somebody who watches it daily. But anyways, thanks for watching. Hopefully that was enjoyable. See ya. Bye bye.